joint activity by St. Paul School of Theology and Oklahoma City University. I'm Nancy Howell, and I'm here as the moderator of the panel. I teach theology and philosophy of religion at St. Paul, and my specialty is science, theology, and ministry, a course that I'm teaching. And you can wave to my students all around the room and on the screen. And I welcome you all. My colleague, our dean, Sharon Betzworth, intended to be here tonight, but was not able to. And she ordinarily would have introduced the panel. And I am going to do a hybrid introduction. I'll give a general introduction, and then I'd like each speaker, if you want, to say more about yourself, especially as it might relate to your presentation. All right, so we have with us Dr. Stephen Prilliman, Professor and Chair of Chemistry here at OCU. We have Dr. Shao, who is from the Department of Psychology here also at the Petrie College of Arts and Sciences in Oklahoma City. We have Amy Osatinski. Dr. Osatinski is Associate Professor of Theater History and head of the BA in Theater Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the School of Theater. And then our regular colleague, Dr. Lisa Wolfe.
Regular. We're supposed to be irregular.
Someone who has taught with us since OCU and St. Paul got married some time ago, is professor and endowed chair of Hebrew Bible here at the Wimberley School of Religion. So we caucused and decided we would start with sciences and move down the table, ending with Hebrew Bible, which is appropriate. It kind of moves backward, sort of chronologically, doesn't it? But tonight our focus is on the question, what does it mean to be human, which is the topic of the exhibit that we're hosting at our Kansas campus. This exhibit focuses on the way that community, compassion, and imagination have arisen among human ancestors. It looks at everything from our genetic connectedness to the way forensic science has shown us the faces that might have gone with the skulls that we have sort of dug up, mostly in Kenya and China and other countries around the world. It shows us the history of art, including the paleoarchaeology, anthropology of jewelry, one of my personal favorites, you know, and what that's all about. It shows us about human interactions, and I hope the panel can help us think more about the ways that science affects the way you see what it means to be human. So we'll start with Dr. Prilliman.
So I think from a science point of view, there's, and I'll try to speak for all sciences, but I'm going to mostly talk about chemistry, but the biology standpoint would be to look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, right? So that the theory of evolution is one of our best models for understanding how speciation happens, meaning how do we get so many different types of birds, and how do we get so many different types of woodpeckers, and why do we get woodpeckers that are specialized in this specific, that are specialized to feeding on a specific seed, right? And that model is a 19th century model, but that precedes any microscopic understanding, which we now have in terms of genetics. So genetics gives us an explanation for why speciation happens, because there are tiny little mistakes made each time our genetic codes are copied, and some of those, just by accident, some of those mistakes end up giving an individual and then eventually a population a certain advantage that helps them to survive and continue to procreate. And that's the kind of cellular, molecular level of speciation and evolution. So we have a macroscopic thing we can see. We can see birds. We can see, and then we have a molecular level explanation, which is the DNA in each of our cells that determines how each of our proteins gets built, et cetera, et cetera. I have a slightly snarkier take on this as a chemist though, because one thing, the human body, if you actually count the number of cells, there's actually more bacteria cells in your body than there are human cells, right? So now they're tinier, they're like 100th the size of human cells. So like by mass, you are more human than you are bacteria. But if you put them under a microscope and you count the cells, there's more bacteria cells than human cells. There's also a funny issue where at the level of your atoms, you're constantly, your cells are constantly being rebuilt. Your bones are constantly being broken down and rebuilt. So there's this question of, and I put this to some of my biology colleagues, about do we have any of the atoms in our bodies left over from when we were born? And the answer is probably not. So the question then is like, who are you exactly, right? Like, you know, and so the analogy I draw to this is like the ship of Theseus. So there's this philosophy question, or like thought experiment, right? About like if you take a boat and you sail it off to sea, and you gradually replace all the bits of the boat, and you come back, is it the same boat or not? Right? And so, I don't know, the human body is, you know, there's just, I mean, when you were born, you were 10 pounds. 7 of those pounds were water. Like that's gone every 2 weeks, you know, like, so there's just not, you know, I think there's a lot of questions about what, you know, chemistry doesn't give us a lot of good answers on this, right? There's more questions than answers. So.
Which area of chemistry is your specialty?
I'm a physical chemist, supposedly, but which my current physical chemistry students might question that. But I'm also I do my research in chemical education, so that's my.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm E, and I'm a cognitive psychologist. The psychology is very broad. Cognitive psychology studies the mental processes. Okay, so if you ask the same question, and what makes human, and before 2019, my answer is I do not know. But 2019, a wonderful undergrad student approached me in a class and said, hey, Dr. Shao, what do you think, how we define human? Okay, I said, I do not know, but as a teacher, I want to learn more so that I can pass information to the students. So from that student question, I did some research about what psychologists have done about this topic. And we have 2 groups of psychologists have contributed most. One group of psychologists is cognitive psychology, okay? So they study how people define human as a natural category. Okay, what they have found is, this is something as what Stephen has proposed, and is they provide different natural categories, okay, including human and, for example, animal, primates, all the other things. And they ask the questions, if here's an object, here's a target that is not typical of this category, do you think this is still, that still belong to this category? And we participants, we Homo sapien participants, we are very arrogant, okay? We rated all the other categories are more flexible, okay? If you're not typical member of this category, you may not belong. But for those participants, a person, a human, to begin with, not to be a typical one, they still belong to this category, okay? So we call this essentialist. We believe that, a cognitive psychologist believe that there is something underlying, okay, to define human being, okay? Rather than any specific features or characteristics, you're just who you are. And they have thought experiment, as Stephen has mentioned. They ask young children, okay, because they are not polluted by our knowledge, okay? And they ask young children, hey, if we transplant blood between a human being and an animal, do you think the human being, okay, receive the blood from the animal species? Do you think this is still a human being? Okay, young children are more likely to say yes for blood transplant, okay? And also just now, Stephen has mentioned DNA. That's a fancy term. Young children are still going to say, yeah, I think they're still a human being, even though the DNA has been transplanted. So I just want to show you, we seem to be very rigid. We maintain an all or none category of human beings, okay? We say we are human beings, okay? We are resistant to any changes that you are proposing, okay? And despite of DNA, I think that's a very cool one in a thought therapy, but not thought experiment, but young children will still say, no, they are human beings, even though they're not perfect, even though their DNA has been changed, we still believe they are who they are. Okay, so that's what I have found from the students' question. Okay, and if you have heard about uncanny effect, that is in engineering, in robots, what we have found out, interestingly, when the robots are more similar to human beings, we hated that. We have very strong disgusting feelings towards that. I think that is tied towards essentialism. We try to maintain a boundary. That's who we are. If you share strong similarity with us, we don't like you. You are definitely not a member of us. Okay, so.
Oh, well, this is fun because I took a totally different approach. So what does it mean to be human? That's the question that we all were asked a few months ago. And as I began percolating about an answer, I quickly had one for my discipline, yet the question that we were asked wasn't just about how my discipline views the essence of humanity, but also about how my faith tradition views it. The intersection of the two is far more complex, and I'm not sure if I have a clear answer, but the exercise of contemplating this question has certainly led me down many paths of thought, the winding paths. Tonight, I'm going to share a few of those winding ideas with you. So I'll start with the easy answer. I'm a theater historian and a theater artist. I investigate the past while simultaneously creating theater in the present. I say that the question of what makes us human is easy to answer because I'm lucky enough to engage in theatrical play for a living. That's what makes us human. Play. There are many theories about the origins of theater, some of them more robust than others, some more plausible than others, and some of them, unfortunately, based on very narrow Western and positivist worldviews. Those have sadly and stubbornly held on for far too long. No, the Greeks were not first. There is direct evidence that the earliest performance traditions actually come from Mesoamerica, but that's not really the question I was asking. There are two broad theories of the origins of theater that I think answer the question at hand. Those theories, rather than stating who was first, speak to the nature of humanity, speak to the essence of what makes us human. The ludic impulse and the mimetic impulse. First, the ludic impulse. This comes from the Latin word ludus, which means to play. The ludic impulse is the impulse that is inherent in all humans to play. Think about it. From the time that we are very young, we play. We play peekaboo as babies, we play pirates or princesses, regardless of our genders. When we are young children, we play tag in the schoolyard, we play house, we play doctor. There is an impulse to play that is innate to us as humans. The second is the mimetic impulse. Mimesis is the process of imitation. Humans have an innate instinct to imitate. Again, think about what we do as children, as babies. Mimesis is also dangerous and has been seen as dangerous for a long time. Plato talks about how theater is dangerous because it's false. Never mind that he wrote his works in the form of plays, but he asserted that the ability to imitate others and reflect truth to power makes imitation, makes theater dangerous. Plato was the OG of anti-theatrical bias. However, the fear of theater has not gone away. Just look at what happened in the last few weeks. Our national theater, the Kennedy Center, was taken over by the Trump administration, by Trump himself, and programming is being canceled. Notably, a musical for children called Finn was canceled, and there is speculation that that cancellation was because there is a song in the show about a boy shark who loves sparkles. Very, very dangerous. Theater has the ability to disseminate ideas and change people's minds. Therefore, theater can be dangerous to those who seek power and who seek to cling to power. But again, not the topic for today. So I could stop there, the ludic impulse and the mimetic impulse, but humans are not the only animals who play or who mimic. That's only part of it. Humans take that play and that imitation and turn it into performance. Humans use these impulses to tell stories and create performances. For example, in Mesoamerica, before recorded evidence of performances in ancient Greece, we have records of elaborate performances performed in celebration of the gods by the Maya. The impulse impulse to play and mimic was harnessed into codified performances to honor and worship gods. These performances even led to human sacrifices, which Western society has grossly misrepresented. The Maya believed that human sacrifice was an act of ahil, or an act of creation. According to scholar Diana Taylor, the Maya believed that there was no real division between the earth and the gods, and that the sacrificial subjects would bear messages between the earth and the gods. These practices that seem barbaric to us as contemporary Westerners were in fact acts of peaceful creation, and these victims were honored by the ability to be sacrificed. They would often play the part of the god, Dionysus, to whom they would be sacrificed for weeks before the ritual or performance of the sacrifice, and be showered with gifts and honor. When the colonizers arrived, they viewed these acts as barbaric and didn't seek to understand them in the context of Maya culture, but rather interpreted them through their own Western viewpoint. So history and popular culture has misrepresented these acts of creation as acts of barbarism. The cultural bias at play led to many years of misunderstanding and misinformation, but I will move on as this is not theater history class. If I start to talk about misinformation, we're going to get way off track. So the impulse to play and the impulse to imitate channeled into codified performance. That's what makes us human according to my discipline. But how does this connect to my faith tradition? That is a more complicated question for me to answer. So I am Jewish. Really, I am Jew-ish. I grew up in Reform Judaism, or Judaism light, as my family used to joke. For those of you unfamiliar, Reform Judaism is built on the idea that the Torah is inspired by God, but was created by humans, and so it can and should be flexible to meet contemporary times. This means that many Jews do not keep kosher or do not strictly observe the Sabbath, etc. In contrast, Orthodox Jews are much more strict in their adherence to Jewish custom and law, even those who are modern Orthodox and who blend traditional Jewish custom with modern life. Growing up, I was raised in a Reform temple, and a relatively liberal one. My mother's family was a mix of Reform and Orthodox Jews. My grandmother's family was very much Reform, but my grandfather's family was, and still is, modern Orthodox. This was a great point of contention in the early years of their marriage, as my grandfather was far more interested in my grandmother and in bacon than in remaining Orthodox. Now, I really don't blame him. My grandmother was hot, and bacon is, well, bacon. My father's family is equally interesting, and that also has to do with bacon. My father was born in Israel the year before it became a recognized state. He grew up as a secular Jew. Again, this had everything to do with bacon, because my grandmother Eliza would walk across the bridge to the non-Jewish side of town to purchase bacon on the weekends, as it could not be purchased at the Jewish markets. My father moved to the United States in 1972 for college. A fun story about that, he wanted to be an engineer and received several offers, including one from MIT, but chose the University of Miami for the weather. Thankfully, though, he did, because he met my mother in Miami, they got married, eventually moved home to Colorado, and created a mixed household, half Reform and half secular. I will pause here for a moment to explain what I mean by secular Judaism, as this is a term that also may not be familiar to you all. Judaism is both a faith and a culture. So there are many Jews in the world who are culturally Jewish, but not religious. That's how my father was raised, and that's really how I identify now. My Jewish culture is inextricably entwined in my identity, but I'm not religious. Now back to my faith tradition and what makes us human, as I have veered way off course again. I went to Sunday school at Temple Emmanuel in Denver, Colorado. Temple Emmanuel was one of 2 Reform synagogues. Really, I was dragged to Sunday school and high holiday services for many years as a child. I was bat mitzvahed at 13, but after that stopped attending because my schedule of singing and acting lessons and performances got too heavy for me to continue to attend. I was not sad about this. In fact, I think that my desire to not attend Sunday school may have been just as much of a motivator for those lessons and performances as my passion for them was. Anyway, as I grew up going to Sunday school and also going to a very touchy-feely private school where we were encouraged to follow our curiosities and explore our passions, I started to ask a lot of questions. And often those questions would come out at Sunday school in ways that were really not appreciated. Honestly, I was kind of an asshole. But there was one person who appreciated them. I have a vivid memory of a conversation when I was around 12 years old, just before my bat mitzvah, with one of my rabbis, Rabbi Greenbaum. Now, Rabbi Greenbaum was the cool rabbi. He was young and hip, and he played an electrified acoustic guitar at services. Seriously cool. On Sunday, after a particularly rude exchange between myself and my Sunday school teacher, to no one's surprise, I was a handful. I was sent out of the room to cool off, and I ran into Rabbi Greenbaum. He sat with me and asked how I was doing and asked how my Hebrew lessons were going, and I remember vividly telling him that none of it mattered because I didn't believe in God. I think I said something along the lines of, show me the proof. If we can scientifically prove everything else, I'll believe in God when you prove it to me. He laughed and he told me he was proud of me for telling him this and for questioning God. Really? Proud? I was confused. He continued by sharing that one of the greatest things that we can do is to question, to ask questions of everything, including whether or not God exists. To question, he said, makes us human and makes us better Jews. God wants us to question. I was baffled. Here was the rabbi, mind you, the cool rabbi, not one of the old stuffy rabbis, telling me that it was not only okay to question my belief in God, but that it was expected and even a mitzvah or a good deed. Now, I know my recollection of this moment is probably wildly inaccurate, but the spirit of this interaction had a profound impact on me. I held on to that conversation perhaps a little too tightly. If you ask some of my high school teachers, they will tell you I weaponized the word why. As an adult, I have built my life, my faith, really my continued questioning of faith, and my career on asking questions. So here it is the TLDR, too long didn't read, for you all. As a theater historian and a secular Jew, I believe that it is our ability to ask questions, to question faith, to question authority, to ask why, that makes us human. That, combined with the ludic impulse, the mimetic impulse, and the channeling of both of those things into performance. What makes us human is our ability to take our questions about the very foundation of our world and using our impulses to imitate and play, create performance, create theater. It is theater that asks the question why that makes us human. Why does the sun rise? Why do birds sing? Why do great men and women do terrible things? Why is there love? Why is there hate? Why are we barreling down the path to authoritarianism? And why are so many people ignoring it? It is the performance of the question why that separates us from all other animals. Theater allows us to perform our whys, and therefore theater makes us human.
Well, so I'm Lisa Wolfe, and I'm the biblicist on the panel, and I'm also a Christian theologian. I'm an ordained pastor in the United Church of Christ, and I bring both of those hats to these comments. So my short answer to the question, what does it mean to be human, is critical thinking. But I want to unpack that a little bit, and I want to start by naming somebody who's very important to me in my journey, and that is Mr. Stewart, Ron Stewart. He was my high school biology teacher, but he was also a volunteer in my youth group at church. And so I had this embodied example growing up of there's no need to separate science and religion. And that was very meaningful to me because I loved biology. My first major was biology, and I loved studying evolution in particular. That was something that really intrigued me. And so I'm so glad that I never was, I'll just say, infected by this, I think, wrong-headed idea that some Christians have had that says that science and religion cannot intersect. So that's my starting point. I've had a number of times in my career where I've had colleagues who didn't know me very well, who assumed that because I'm a biblicist and a theologian, that I could not be friendly to science. And I take offense at that. So I want to unpack this a little bit. I want to talk about, in terms of the Hebrew Bible, of course, the Genesis 1 through 3, which are two different, very different creation stories. One which ends with the creation of humans, and one which begins with the creation of humans. And those, to me, are truthful stories, but they are not factual. So I outright reject the idea that I know some, I think mostly Christians have proposed, which is the idea that maybe every one of the 7 days equals 1,000,000 years, and so that's how evolution in Genesis 1 through 2:4a can be compatible. No, that's just not even, you have missed the whole point. Genesis 1 is this beautiful poetry. It's liturgy. It attests to the truth of a God that ancient Israelites worshipped, who was so powerful that creation just could come from speech, and that there was no conflict needed, like in other cultures of the time, in order for creation to happen. It was peaceful, and the whole thing was structured around the seventh day Sabbath, which was survival for the Jews of the time of the exile, when this story was probably either written or finalized, when that community was on the verge of extinction, especially maybe not necessarily all of the humans in that community, but the religion that they clung to. And one of the major ways that they could retain their religion was by doing something that they could do even without a temple, even far from the place where they had really always worshiped their God. They could keep Sabbath, they could rest. So that story is so important, and we miss the point if we try to say that it like overlay science on top of it. No. And Genesis 2 and 3, as I said, is a completely different type of story, completely delightful storytelling of a human created out of the humus by this very human-like deity, and then divided into male and female. And then it tells stories about things like things that humans have always wondered about, like why does it take so much work to get food out of the ground? And why do snakes creep us out? And why do humans tend to do the exact thing that somebody told them not to do? That's the kind of exploration that we get in that delightful story. And a third creation story that I want to name, mainly because it gets neglected way too often, and I encounter students frequently who say, I did not hear the story. I think I've been reading the Bible my whole life. And that is Proverbs 8, where we see wisdom at creation with God. So this is clearly not an anti-intellectual text. It extols the virtue of human thought and of critical thinking. And those wisdom thinkers, they were the ones in the Hebrew Bible who really grappled with critical thinking and asking, you must love the wisdom literature, I'm guessing, or you would. If I'm gonna sell it to you, I know. Why is the major question, and pointing out what's wrong with the world. So in the book of Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, the Hebrew title, there's this beautiful mirrored poetic verse. I see that the righteous are treated according to the acts of the wicked, and the wicked are treated according to the acts of the righteous. Now that flies in the face of a lot of traditional theology of ancient Israel. But that thinker, that wisdom thinker, was compelled by what they saw. And I think so many of us are as well. The last thing that I want to add to this is something that we see both in the Hebrew Bible, and I'll creep into the New Testament. I know my students will be shocked. But it's a New Testament quote from the Hebrew Bible. So in Leviticus 19, it says to love your neighbor. And in the gospel writers have Jesus saying that because, of course, he was a learned Jew, apparently. He knew his stuff. And so he talks about love your neighbor as well. And so I think that impulse for compassion and for community, and it is really also an important part of what it means to be human. Asking questions, but also finding resolution for the absurdity of life in community, and also in joy. And that was another big theme in Ecclesiastes, is to seize the day, to find some joy, eat and drink and enjoy your life. And one thing I was really intrigued by in watching the videos about the exhibit in Kansas City is that one of the artifacts there was of a man who apparently aged quite a long time, and his whole bottom jaw had deteriorated. And so one thing that you had taken out of that, Dr. Howell, was that the community had to help him. And that his survival to that old age of living without a bottom jaw was reliant on this community. And so to me, that's another really important aspect of what it means to be human.
Thank you. I'll tell you a little more about the old timer. And it is that he lived 1.78 million years ago, which shows that the importance of community and compassion were part of what it meant to be pre-human or human. Definitely homo, for sure. Yeah, thank you. Now, I'll start to see the question and the answer period, if I may. I'm fascinated, partly because of the exhibit, and partly because one of my degrees is philosophy, with that whole tension between change, as Dr. Prilliman was talking about. You know, not only have some of us changed a lot since we were younger, no longer have our cells. Not only do we have bacteria, but I bet some of us have viruses and molds, fungi inhabiting us. There are a lot of changes that go on. And yet there are senses of permanence. You know, that essence, as if we're pretty sure we know we're human, although I'll check IDs on the way out, to be sure. And then there is also the whole specter of determinism. You know, one of the questions that arises in the science religion conversations is, did my genes make me do it? You know, how much does my physical makeup influence who I am? And this becomes really interesting when we look at a panel at the exhibit. And on one side, it tells me that I share 60% of my DNA with bananas. Something like 73% with the chicken. 98.4% with chimpanzees, and yet 99.9% with every other human being. How do your fields help you see change, permanence, determinism, all essence, all as part of what it means to be human? Do we have to pick one? Do we have to reject some? How would you answer the question? You don't have to answer your whole field. You know, just in your opinion.
I will just share a little bit. Just now, I'm biased. I just share from the cognitive psychologist perspective. And my conclusion is, it seems that we resist the change and we are holding essentialism. But if you talk to a social psychologist, they're going to tell a very different story. And they have found phenomena that if we perceive we are in group, and then we're going to treat our group in a very cruel way, then we're going to dehumanize these people. We're going to call these people as animals. We're going to call these people as robots, okay? All these type of comments are just trying to deny their human category membership. So social psychologists will tell you, say, no, we are not holding to the category. We are treating people differently based on our relationship. Okay, so.
Well, I think on that, from a standpoint of theater, we think about how empathy is able to interrupt that process of dehumanization in and out. And I think part of the ability of theater or art in general as a mirror to reflect. And so when I can see myself in that person who is not me, the ability to then make the connection that, oh wait, there's more about us that's similar than different, and maybe we should not, you know, ostracize those that we see as different. And that is a, you know, pie in the sky Pollyanna moment from the world of theater to say that, you know, but that kind of empathy and the ability on an individual level for someone to come in, experience a piece of art, whether it's theater, visual art, music, whatever it is, and to be able to see something of themselves in that art in a way that shows them that they're not that different from someone who is unlike them.
don't know that anyone wants to go here, but when you say determinism to a chemist, I'm teaching a quantum mechanics course right now. So the whole point of quantum mechanics is that there are the electrons that are like at the smallest level of the human body, right? You're composed of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Those electrons follow rules that are not deterministic. They are entirely probabilistic. There's this famous quote by Einstein when he was responding to the quantum theory that when it was being developed, he said, "God does not play dice with the universe," and he's completely wrong. God plays dice with the universe. Like at the level of the electrons in your body, there's no determinism. So it's
So another argument for change.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So well, and just not being able to predict 100% what's going to happen for any input, right? Like you can't always predict the outcome at that level. Now, people and chickens and whatever else, we don't follow quantum laws, which is good. If you walk through a doorway, you're going to walk through a doorway. But if you put an electron through a crystal, it may or may not come out at whatever angles, right? So unfortunately, we don't obey those rules, right? But and so it's dangerous to apply those in any other situation than the electron. But yeah, I think determinism is a, I mean it's a 18th century concept that when science of the early 20th century came along, had to be from a scientist.
Well, in theology and in Bible, they're such intriguing topics. Can humans change? And my students are always very interested in debating that issue and examining that issue. But when we look at that in the context of the Bible, many of my students come to the Bible with the assumption that the theological assumption that God does not change. And so I always enjoy helping them think critically about those texts so that they can see that there are plenty of texts that show that God does change, or that there were at least some of the books, because of course the Bible is an anthology, to borrow a word from Dr. Stern, our speaker a couple weeks ago, that some of those books portray God in that way very clearly as changeable. As you were talking, it kind of struck me. I wonder if theologically there's been some discomfort with the idea, especially among Christians, of God as changeable, mutable, because that makes God too human. Kind of back to the robot example, but the thing with God is we don't want God to be like us. We need God to maybe be impressively different, better than a robot, so that's different from that example. But I think that question is really relevant to theology.
God changes, in my view, throughout Scripture, and theologians stand with me and against me on that.
Right. I think most biblicists would be with you, though.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I am the biblical literalist among us.
Right.
Right. But the whole idea of Moses having a talk with God and then God changed God's mind.
Right. And Jonah.
The whole idea of incarnation as a kind of changeability seems to speak to changeability in God. But there is something I want to acknowledge, and that is the security of knowing that something about God is permanent. Something is reliable. We can depend on God. So I want to open the door for there to be lots of interpretations of God, of humanity, and don't be surprised if Olivia has the first question.
So if understanding what it means to be human is being able to ask the question of why, how do we know that other species don't ask why because they can't communicate like we can communicate? And if they are asking why, are there ways that we could see that we could possibly put, oh, this is them figuring out their why?
Say if they start doing theater, I don't know. Well, I know the answer, maybe you on that note.
Dolphins perform for people to get food.
Some actors actually get paid.
Some do, not most though, I mean, if you look at it, not most.
And I do know, I think that there was a chimpanzee named, what was his name? Mr. Muggs or something like that, at the Chicago Zoo, who was trained to act in certain ways to mimic the behavior of a human, and he always wore little suits and bow ties and hat, and he had a cane. Others were taught to serve tea.
Oh yeah, there are long traditions of
Yeah.
animal acts, I mean,
So,
in vaudeville,
yeah,
nobody wanted
yeah.
to follow the animal act because the animal act would always bring the house down, and so if you were the act that came after the animal act, you knew you were the
Yeah.
worst act in the show.
So play and mimicry are the easy things, but like, I think like Olivia says, we don't know how much there is of asking why. We may have hints at experiences of awe in the literature, but whether that is opposing the why, I don't know. Are there other questions?
I was just a little curious about, I love the quantum mechanics, sorry. Especially probabilistic at the subatomic level, but people seem to think at some point it's going to be deterministic, and there's a belief that this is necessarily a conflict, which I think goes to the question of how different is it to be human. So we share a lot of DNA, chemically the same. Things are bouncing around, things change. At what point do we decide this is chemically human and this is not? It's a very bright line that people seem to want to draw, and I don't have a clue why they do that. My dog behaves in ways that I wish most humans did. Sometimes I'm thinking, oh, I've met that person, but how do you draw a line in the sand, as it were, when it's both probabilistic and somewhat deterministic?
So the pre-genetic answer to that is that you have, so in terms of speciation, two individuals belong to different species if they cannot procreate. Okay. So, but we've had all this great genetic work that's been done over the last 10 or 15 years that shows that most of us are walking around with a decent little chunk of Neanderthal DNA. Like most of us are at least this was the European descent, at least a couple percent of our DNA is of Neanderthal origin, right? So at least from and there you have both parts, the species level and the DNA level, right? That this was that we and Neanderthals were apparently compatible enough to not be separate species, and yet that they would definitely have been regarded as the other, right? As modern humans moved into Europe and discovered, whoa, there are these people here. Who are these, right? And so there's all kinds of theories about how that integration would have happened. I'm partial to the conquering theory because that's what we seem to do usually. But yeah, there's not, at least in that case, there is no bright line, right? Now, at what point? I don't know that there's a good answer to that. So, but people draw lines all the time, right?
Yeah,
it's
part of the point.
Yeah,
Very arbitrary.
Right.
It gets really messy, just to determine whether a virus is a living organism or not.
Oh yeah.
Because it's a sort of borderland kind of creature.
I mean, I'd like to make a case for not drawing a line. I mean, I think it's great to talk about what does it mean to be human, but maybe focus on the what does it mean to be, and then the human part can be like, it can be really fuzzy, and that's kind of fun, actually. I think imagining like your ideas about animals performing and viruses and stuff like that, I think humans often get in big trouble when we draw lines around certain definitions, so.
One of my favorite books is called The Less Noble Sex by Nancy Tuana, and she writes about how lines have been drawn. Even Darwin drew lines by saying things like, females are the less evolved of European beings, and Africans are less evolved than European males. And then there is a whole trajectory, leading to the philosophy of Hegel and the hierarchical thinking about where the lines fall within humanity. And then thank you, Hitler.
Well, and the placing of people, things, characteristics on
Yes.
binaries, that seems to be human nature, and then, thinking about deconstruction in the 20th century, philosophically, and then trying to explode and deconstruct all of these closely held binaries that we are still rearing their ugly heads within human society.
Part of it's also the notion that humans stand apart within nature, right? So like we tend to see ourselves as kind of outside of nature, and like nature is that thing over there, that happens at Yellowstone Park, that's not, and we're not part of that. But our DNA very clearly says we are a part of nature. We're that closely related to bananas, right? There's not a lot, there's not a lot of debate there, and there, my family is Roman Catholic, and I too, but I also have my native side of the family. Native traditions, people are just a part of nature. We don't stand apart from nature in I shouldn't say all, many native traditions. The stories and including creation stories are very much that we are more closely a part of nature rather than standing apart from it. I think that standing apart from nature is also a place where we get into a lot of trouble. It's part of the issue that people have with evolution, right? Is that like folks want us to be clearly different from nature, and it's.
I know we have two questions. Elena, what have you got?
I have some from the chat from our friends on Zoom. So Jill has a two-part question. How do our emotions, relationships, and sense of purpose shape our understanding of what it means to be human? And then, is being human defined by biology, consciousness, or something more, like our ability to create, empathize, and tell stories?
Okay, I can answer the first part, and I'll continue the story from social psychologists, because they are so fascinated by the phenomena of dehumanization, so they continue to find, the mechanism. And what they have found is we seem to perceive two underlying human traits, okay? One dimension of human traits are intellectual related. So these are the things are associated with civil society, okay, we can learn. And so it's about, for example, communication. We have language ability, we have reasoning ability. So these are things we think the other animal species are not capable of doing. We call that human unique traits, okay? Then another line of traits are human nature traits. So these are associated with emotion and empathy, all related with that. So these social psychologists say, hey, we are different from all the other species, or all the other kinds. We are different from animals because we have a human unique trait. We are very intellectual, we are smart, okay? But we are different from mechanics, machines, because we have the human nature traits. We have emotion, we have empathy, all these things make us unique, okay? So these are the social psychologist perspective. And I also want to clarify for one of my previous conclusions, I say, participants said they're not going to change the category, even the DNA has been changed. That conclusion was based on American children, okay? The percentage is very high, almost 80% children say no, they're still human beings, even though the DNA has been changed. But the same question has been asked to Indian children. They hold a different view in terms of the relationship between humans and life, or the afterlife, and the nature. And they actually dropped the rate to 50%, okay? So So I would say it really depends on who you are asking and their life experience.
Thanks for putting it in context. Yeah, broader context. Would you repeat the two questions again so that we can see what the other panelists?
Sure, and the chat is blowing up with questions. So the two-part question from Jill again is, how do our emotions, relationships, and sense of purpose shape our understanding of what it means to be human? Do you want me to stop there or read the other one?
I'll just check to see whether anyone else wanted to speak to that question. Okay, then let's go to Dr. Davis.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from your different perspectives where you think moral agency plays a part in our understanding of what it means to be a human person, and also the experience of responsibility or having responsibility is something that human beings possess. What are your thoughts on that? A key aspect of our humanity.
I'll take it if nobody else wants to so far. I mean, I think that's a crucial part of humanity, but I also think, and this is really based on my long-term relationship with Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, that there are good reasons to question the efficacy of moral agency and to wonder how much it matters. In the end, I personally, and I think this is my really faith-based response, is to say, no, it does matter. We do need to try. We do need to intervene. We shouldn't just be complacent and crushed by the weight of absurdity or just have a little party on the side to feel a little better. But I get it. I think I can see the questions. I can see the legitimacy of questions about why should we try? Can it really matter? But I want to cling to it personally.
I think to add on to that, I think historically you can see art as a way of working through those questions. I mean, I think immediately as you talk about absurdity and all of that, I'm thinking back to the theater of the absurd from the mid-20th century that Europe was destroyed to a level that had never been seen before, and the theater that comes from that time is godless. And is really questioning, why does life matter? What is out there, what is beyond us? And the answer many of that theater comes to is nothing. We are because we are, and that's all it is. And so, but yet that pendulum swinging, when you start to see, as you get into the 1960s and 70s, a lot more theater engaging with these moral questions and Bible stories and religion directly as a piece of that. So I think it's art becomes a way to wrestle with questions, with moral questions.
Okay, Joey, and then we'll go back to the chat.
Mine's kind of in the same boat, and I think I'm gonna get all of your disciplines intersectionally, except for you, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
So I mean, I read a book in class once that said that the most recently developed part of the brain, I guess I'm gonna keep, is as the part that gives us empathy and that allows us to kind of overcome our parasympathetic nervous system, all these things. And so that's what makes us humans compared to marsupials and et cetera, is empathy. I also see that means something to me. But then there's also this like deep component of like what species is capable of more destructive force than humanity. And so how do empathy and violence play a role in distinguishing humanity? And is violence a part of what makes us human? And if it is, how do we reconcile that as people who are uncomfortable with violence?
Good question. Because I think about it, I'd say that it has to do with community, and that it's that age-old question of nature versus nurture, right? That idea of what are we taught? How are these things modeled for us? You can go back in many cultures, any culture across the globe, and looking at the mythologies and stories of those cultures, and there's going to be the same kinds of things, right? There are these things that are innate to us, but what the specifics of that have more to do with how that community has come together. I don't know if I'm making any kind of sense, but that idea of we have a great propensity for violence and a great propensity for love or empathy, and which direction it goes depends on the morals of the community, perhaps, and sort of some of those other things that come from, I don't know, art. Or, that's what my discipline would say, that you can combat that through art, but just thinking about, yeah, it's a half answer to that question. If someone wants to finish out the answer.
Well, Joey, I think violence is a really good example to bring up in this conversation, actually, and it's kind of delightful that none of us came up with it to start with. But as a Hebrew Bible scholar, I often, as I'm sure you've heard me say, well, people who have just met me, oh, how can you study the Hebrew Bible? It's just all this violence. And yes, there is violence there, and I think it's really important to try to understand where it comes from. And I think one of the places it comes from is from suffering. And many Bible scholars' interpretation of the violence in the Bible is not so much that it even actually happened, but that they were revenge fantasies from people who had no possible hope of enacting violence against those who had committed violence against them in the first place. And so, I think that is a part of humanity, is that taste for revenge, but also the extent to which the Bible imposes those human traits on the deity. And one thing that I find so intriguing when you think about it that way is that throughout the Hebrew Bible, in multiple places, maybe a dozen different places, you get this parts of the description of God that first comes up in, I believe it's Exodus 34, where Moses encounters the Lord, and then you get this self-revelation from the Lord, merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And it talks about how the Lord will provide mercy to the 1,000th generation and judgment to the 3rd and 4th generation. So if we do the math, even conservatively, it's like 250 times more merciful than judging. But still, everybody comes up with, oh, the Hebrew Bible is so violent. So I think it's interesting to read that violence as a reflection of the humans who were writing about their deity, who truly needed their God to be able to protect them.
But I'm wondering, because humans are not the only animals that are violent.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's something about human violence, perhaps that's different. I mean, I'm definitely not a scientist, so couldn't answer that, but.
Renee Girard's mimetic violence, to use your word.
Yes, yeah.
To stop me from going into primate studies, would you bring us another question from the chat?
Sure, this is from Matt. On the determinism discussion, I wonder about the role of conscious awareness of our own actions and our self-reflection on them. My lay understanding is that there is a delay between mental intention and action in the world, and then another gap before consciousness of our own actions. I wonder how this interacts with the role of habits and routines in human actions, i.e. repeated actions becoming more ingrained in neural pathways and so on. Thoughts?
I'm afraid that's your question.
Dr. Shao, just now, when Dr. Davis asked a question, I was thinking and I was searching back in my brain. I know that there are a group of psychiatrists study morality. They also try to push the question of what makes human being. And I think their answer is this agency. So if you play an active role in your own behavior, regardless it's pro-social or violent, then we call these make human being. Because they thought that animal species, they do not have the aging part. Okay. So that might be able to answer the question to some extent as well.
Got any chemistry on there? Okay.
They're getting deep in the chat.
Okay,
Wow.
okay, keep going, keep going.
This is from Kaylee. Do we get to actively choose how human we are if we measure humanity by the way we react and interact with those around us? Not just other humans, but everything that is created around us. If we are all connected in terms of we being nature and self, how can we measure that aspect of humanity? It gets deeper than that after this, so prepare yourself straight and follow it.
What's the essence of that question, as you've all heard it? That's what we need to address.
I'll just reread the last part of that. If we are all connected in terms of the nature and self, how can we measure that aspect of humanity?
I'm not sure you can. I think there's a lot of gray area. And, you know, I'm trying to kind of like see the through line between a lot of folks' questions here, but, you know, there's a human being in, and this is, I'm straying from my science background, so apologies if I get over my skis, but a human being as an individual behaves very differently than a human being in a community. And in a society which has certain morals, certain values that are inculcated in that individual from an early age, right? And so the intellectual question of what makes an individual a human or not is it's a fun academic question from a science perspective, but like you can't measure it. Like it's not it's saying this is and this is not human, like or you know, the better thought experiment is where on the evolutionary tree are we like, a human, right? Like that's not like there's so much gray area there, right? It's really not worth it's not the fact that there isn't a good answer, I think, is just the answer.
Exactly.
That's I'm not sure if I actually answered the question. That's my rambling thoughts on it.
Okay, deep breath. This question is from Dr. Simmons, and I'm not even sure I can pronounce half of what he's asked, but I'm gonna do my best. Yuval Noah Harari's nexus suggests that it is our ability to create stories and build information networks that distinguishes us from other life on the planet and perhaps makes us human. Those stories, for example, how we create an entity like the nation state make us human. A story like the nation state enables a network of 350 million persons to define themselves as Americans. Other species cannot do that. Do you think Harari's argument is substantial?
Well, my easy answer to that is yes, because I think that telling stories is one of the essential things that makes us human, and that's on a grand scale. I deal with stories on a smaller scale, but I would say yes.
Yeah, it's convincing. I haven't read the book, but.
I had a political science professor in college who was very influential on me. That was his central argument about politics, was that what matters are the stories that we tell ourselves about politics, that's how we cleave together as, he was particularly interested in Texas politics, because that's what it was, but, Texans have all these mythologic stories about themselves that they love, right? And the rest of us, it drives us crazy, but, and I'm sure that's true about Americans and the rest of the world too. So, the stories are very important, right? In chemistry or in science in general, we create models which are fancy stories that help us interpret the data.
Well, and of course,
most of my colleagues would hate me calling it a story, but.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one of the problems is when people take the stories that have become scripture and try to factualize them, then they've lost what they actually meant.
And I was gonna say, Lisa, when I mean, as a Roman Catholic, like, I was taught in Sunday school that the Garden of Eden was not a physical, like, literal place.
Were you?
Yeah.
Interesting. That's interesting.
I think I had a very liberal nun teaching.
That must have been post-Vatican
That
II.
must have been Jesuits.
Right.
One of the things I hear emerging from the panel is what we mean by the word human is always socially constructed and largely by story. And whether it's a political story or a biblical story or a cultural story, isn't it? Next question.
This is from Jared. There are many people of faith today who claim that Adam and Eve are literal historic people. What questions or perspectives would you direct them to consider to widen their understanding or perspective?
Well, I mean, I think I would go back to what I said about truth and factuality. And something that is true can be factual, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that we create real problems for ourselves, and as I've said before, that we lose the beauty of a story, like the story about those two humans, after the one human was split into male and female, we lose the story that if we try to make it factual. It's not written, it's obviously not written to be factual. It's full of puns, it's so playful, it's a delightful story, and it is very true. It says many things that are true. And it's not that I'm allergic to science at all. I mean, much of biblical studies is about really using scientific method to analyze text, to date artifacts, to understand what ancient people were like through ethnography, to use of linguistics and grammatical analysis and so forth. And that's dealing in facts. And even theories of interpreting biblical texts. We use essentially scientific method. One scholar makes their case using textual evidence, and then another scholar comes in and says, well, yeah, that's okay, but you missed this and this and this, and then the conversation continues. So I think that the problem with my answer is that for somebody who has been told that it is a doctrinal imperative for them to understand Genesis 2 and 3 as a factual account, then to talk about with it or to try to convince them that it is not factual is such delicate business. And so my pastoral side there then says, you know, you have to be careful. Is my intent to yank this person's faith out from under them? And so as a teacher, this puts me in a precarious place, a teacher who's also a pastor, to try to gently introduce students to some of this and in a way that says, you don't have to accept this. This is a view within biblical scholarship. But on the other hand, there are people of faith, or people who used to be people of faith, who rejected their faith because someone said, this is an imperative, a doctrinal imperative, that you have to understand this text in this way, and if you don't, you are no longer a Christian, and so they say, see ya. And I think that's one way in which contemporary Christianity has really suffered, because unlike Jewish tradition, which didn't have that same kind of doctrinal imperative on those texts, people who are steeped in scientific method, which is frankly like most modern people in one way or another, hopefully, are educated in that way, just can't get their heads around it. And so it can be very tricky business.
Next question. This is from Emily. Is our deep need for belonging something that defines us as human, or is it merely one aspect of a broader human experience?
I would say probably, okay? Just now, I'm impressed by the question and about asking why. And I'll give you the counter argument. Sometimes Homo sapiens, we humans, we do not ask why. And there's one line of research called over imitation, okay? They taught chimpanzees and young kiddos some activities, okay? Chimpanzees see through the whole processes and figure out, okay, if I just want to get food, I can skip some of the steps, okay? Some of the steps are useless, okay? Just touching on the outside of the box, so they smartly skip those steps. But young children figure out, okay, these steps are useless, but they still perform these things, so these actions probably serve functions, okay? So they will over-imitate everything the adult has taught to them, okay? So it's, even though it's useless, it's different from the fact reality. It does not serve any function, but for human beings, because we want to be connected, we still perform anything that we have seen. So that's my answer.
One primatologist has actually defined religion as the need for belonging. And looks at artifacts to claim that pre-Homo sapien humanity, in fact, had that sense of belonging. And there are even rituals that would suggest that that's the case. And she's also looked at primate behavior and discovered similar senses of the need to belong.
This is from Rachel. There's been quite a bit of discussion about how religion is interacted with in light of science, but little about how science is interacted with in light of the influence of religion. What are some ways that religious constructs shape assumptions in scientific exploration? Expanding and constricting influences.
There's a part of me that wants to say, oh, pick me.
Please, go ahead.
I'll get it started. Isaac Newton, as a Christian, believed that God would not create a world without order. And if God created the world with order, then we ought to be able to look carefully at the world and discern what that order is. That was a direct influence of Christianity on science. And when I'm in places like Japan or South Korea, people point out how European and American science really is and how Christianized it is. They'll say things like, do you realize how much American science is concerned about origins? The Big Bang, for example. In Eastern religions, we're not concerned about origins. And we don't start with those questions. So there are direct, very direct, cultural, religious influences on, and individual influences on how religion approaches science, including prohibitions. You know, for example, the work on recombinant DNA raised, and cloning also, raised questions from Christian communities that sort of tamped down some of, or delayed, I'll say, scientific energy for a moment while we all paused and thought about what we were doing. Anybody else? Did I give you time to think of something?
That's perfect.
That was perfect.
I think it's hard sometimes within science to recognize because everyone around you is kind of steeped in the same background. It's hard to see that bigger picture context of where your science comes from. And in grad school, I was in a very international lab. We had a lot of folks from every part of the world in our lab, and but even within that community, that was never a question that would have come up.
This question is from Elena, who is not in the chat. Do you feel like you're in the chat? Do you feel like in your respective disciplines that the lines are getting fuzzier than they used to be? And are we approaching these questions with these modernist trained brains? And are we needing to ask a different kind of question or tell a different kind of story? because of the complexity we now know exists? Or have we always known that that complexity exists?
I'm gonna say no in my discipline, because one of the things that is interesting about theater is that we perform texts from ancient times that are from ancient times to today. And so I think there's something about that revisiting of the ancient as newly relevant within the modern that makes me say no. Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun. It's all the same thing. It's all the same story.
That's incorrect.
Right? There isn't. There's just not. It's the same story over and over and over again. That's just told in different times in different ways. And when we go back and we tell the story of, Hamlet, The Lion King, right? Same thing.
It always makes me fearful that I haven't provided all the footnotes. If there is truly nothing new under the sun.
Yes.
Somebody said this.
Somebody said it before, yeah.
We do have one more question from Jared. Some atheists like Richard Dawkins point to the fact that if humans have been around for millions of years, then suddenly God only takes an interest in people only 3,000 years ago, from people groups found only in one place on the globe, so God must not care about humanity elsewhere before then. What perspective would you offer to this critique?
He's reading the Bible too literally. Kind of taking Christianity or Judaism maybe as the only religious starting point. It's ridiculous. He's granting the terms of the argument. He ceded the terms of the argument to his opponent.
Yeah, there's evidence of ritual that can be called religion in all parts of the globe from forever. I mean, as a performance historian, that's part of how we look at the origins of theater is by looking at ritual from many, many parts of the world. And it's hard in certain parts of the world to even be able to make the connections because of colonialism and how that destroyed so many cultures. But being able to take back all the way that far, there are things that we can call religion for forever.
Right, so to say 3,000 years, so that's based on the origin of Israel? So that's the only existence of religion ever in human, it's a ridiculous starting point.
That was his point.
To be ridiculous?
Yes.
Yeah.
That he was making the case that people who are fundamentalist Christian and believe in this, have to also believe that this is true, which he was arguing is patently false on the basis that you've obviously pointed out.
And he's one of the most fundamentalist Christians I know.
Exactly.
In that what he rejects is not a straw man, but is a very highly biblical literalist version of Christianity with a very simple understanding of God rather than the more complex nuances there are about God, not only in Christianity, but in Judaism, all the monotheistic faiths and the polytheistic faiths and the faiths that have no polys. Into the chat. Oh, Olivia, you're up again.
Yes, so in the class that we're taking, the Science, Theology, and Ministry, we're reading a book called Perspectives on the Historical Adam and Eve. And we read a chapter written by a guy named William Lane Craig. And in that chapter, he proposed the idea that hominins and people were around before Adam and Eve. And yes, he did mention that Adam and Eve were possibly a myth or whatever. But he said that God took two of the hominins and put them in this Garden of Eden, and they were Adam and Eve. That he just picked two random people and expanded their mind capacity. How does that fit with all of the science and things that we've discussed today?
I'll add to the story. This author it does represent conservative evangelical Christianity, but it's in trying to incorporate science in the view. And he does want to account for how humans got a soul and were made in the image of God. So apparently in this whole trajectory of evolution, God paused and said, you two are the winners. And that these two humans had offspring, and then they had offspring. In order to avoid incest, of course, they had to have mated with non-Adam and Eve people to produce children. How do you react with the story working that hard to maintain conservative evangelical Christianity and science at the same time?
I appreciate the effort to give a nod to science, but I think, like I said, about trying to make the 7 days of creation into millions of years or something, you lose the beauty of the story. He ditches that gorgeous, lovely, delightful story of Genesis 2 and 3. You lose what it's about by doing that to it. So to me, that is a low view of scripture, which I feel like he would probably want to reject.
Yeah, it's like two things go on sometimes, trying to preserve the integrity of scripture while calling it myth at the same time. The factual integrity of scripture while calling it myth is a complicated, difficult thing to accomplish well.
I'm just sitting over here thinking about the play we could make of that.
Oh,
It would be hilarious.
I think the easier thing to do would be to do that thing, but to science, right? Like you can take science and as here's a model that if we put in this piece of information gives us a correct prediction of what will happen in the future, and not worry about what does this mean about life and my place in the cosmos? Like I think that's way easier to do, and just say look, if I get the COVID shot, I don't die of COVID, and not worry about what the, I don't know. It seems to me there's the easier out is to take science not as literally, but still accept that there are conclusions we can draw from it that are useful to us, and not allow that to cloud or contradict our faith. I think that's what I'm. Science is not capital T truth. We don't like John Nail, who teaches organic. So I teach general chemistry, which is the freshman course. John teaches organic, the sophomore course, and I tell them stories in Gen Chem. And they go on to John, and he says, all the stuff Prilliman told you, it's close, and it's not quite right. So I'm going to tell you the better version. And then they come back to me in advanced courses, and I say, all of it's wrong. Now I'm going to tell you the real story. But by the way, you're going to go to grad school, and they're going to tell you I'm wrong, right? We get better and better models as we go through as scientists, and it doesn't mean the early ones are bad or wrong or evil. It just means that they're not as good as the next one. They don't always work in every situation. So.
It's the same with history, right? We think we know what the story is until we get more evidence, and that tells us more accurately what the story is, and we continue to get evidence, and then now we start looking at, who's the evidence from, and then how is that coloring the story to be able to try and get as close as we can to truth. But a historian's view of truth is it doesn't exist. We don't know. Because even if you were there, your truth is different than the person next to yours, so we don't have a capital T truth.
And so in the end, really the theater or the story was the truest thing of all.
Yep, exactly.
We have one more question.
I just was trying to think about, maybe something that's missing here. And I don't know that this is missing, but something comes to my mind is a sense of wonder might be part of what we're looking at. And don't ask me how. Where?
There is actually some great writing on awe in the sciences and in psychology in particular, and how transformative experiences of awe are. And we'll have to come back for another panel on that, which is quite worthy. But I want us to thank the panelists that I have. this room, you get a free bookmark. With the Smithsonian graphic on it, and even better, the St. Paul graphic on the back. With a QR code that will take you to events related to the Smithsonian exhibit happening in March, beginning the week of March 24th. We'll have a team of people, including the scientists from the Smithsonian, who will be giving workshops for clergy, for science educators, for religious educators, for all of us in a community conversation, but also will be speaking in chapel. And Rick Potts, who is the curator of the exhibit and the director of the anthropology department at the Smithsonian, will lecture for us one evening. So take this, use the QR code, register for the event. If you can't be on our other campus, then you can attend virtually, like all those folks in the back of the room. So free for you, and it's a good bookmark, by the way. I got the good kind so that it wouldn't deteriorate. The other fun thing I would love for you to do is to be a part of that project of answering the question, what does it mean to be human? On the North Campus, we have a big board where people can write on Post-its and put their answer there. We have started a wall out here on a door. We have the official Post-its. We have pens, and you can write a word or a phrase, or some people have broken into essays on a Post-it. It's very small, right? So I hope you'll contribute to the conversation, because the Smithsonian is collecting all those Post-its, and they're going to be preserved on their website. So we can see what the United States and its visitors from other places are saying. The other thing is, don't forget to see Shannon Hancock on the way out, because you too need a degree from St. Paul's University. I know. So thanks to all of you for coming tonight. And by the way, if you're online, email me at howellnr@spst.edu and send me your answer to what it means to be human, and I'll put it on a Post-it and put it up in the room. That's howellnr@spst.edu. Some of you know that address quite well already. But let's thank the panelists for a great evening.